At 62 years old, Demi Moore is no longer the actress Hollywood once tried to define for her. She has an Oscar nomination, a Golden Globe, and a memoir that laid bare the parts of her life she spent decades keeping private. To understand why her account of her marriage to Ashton Kutcher landed the way it did, it helps to understand the woman telling it. A survivor of a genuinely difficult childhood, one of the biggest movie stars of the 1990s, and someone who has now spent years publicly working through the parts of her story that fame once required her to hide. This is that story, built from her own memoir, her public interviews, and the reporting that has followed her for more than 4 decades. Demi Moore was born Demetria Jean Gwines on November 11, 1962, in Roswell, New Mexico. Her upbringing was unstable by almost any measure. Her parents separated before she was born, and she was raised largely by her mother, Virginia, and a stepfather, Danny Gwines, in a household that moved frequently and struggled financially. Moore has spoken and written about a chaotic early life, one that included her mother's own struggles, and she dropped out of high school at 16 to begin pursuing modeling and acting work in Los Angeles. That early instability is part of the context Moore herself has pointed to when explaining, later in life, why she gravitated toward relationships and situations where she felt she had to earn her place, a pattern she has said resurfaced decades later in her marriage to Kutcher. Long before the Kutcher years in Inside Out, she also wrote about being raped at the age of 15, one of several difficult episodes from her adolescence that she said shaped how she moved through the world as a young woman trying to break into Hollywood. Moore's break into the industry came through the soap opera General Hospital, where she had a recurring role in the early 1980s. From there, she became associated with a group of young actors the media dubbed the Brat Pack, appearing alongside stars like Rob Lowe, Andrew McCarthy, Ally Sheedy, Judd Nelson, and Emilio Estevez, to whom she was briefly engaged in the 1985 ensemble film St. Elmo's Fire. The label followed her for years. She has said in interviews that she found it reductive, even as the film itself became her breakout. The 1990s were the decade that made Demi Moore one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. Ghost, released in 1990 opposite Patrick Swayze, was the highest-grossing film of that year and earned her a Golden Globe nomination. She followed it with a string of commercial hits, including A Few Good Men in 1992, Indecent Proposal in 1993, and Disclosure in 1994. In 1996, she became the highest-paid actress in film history at the time, commanding a then-unprecedented $12.5 million fee to star in Striptease, a milestone that drew as much backlash as admiration, with tabloids at the time nicknaming her Gimme More. The film underperformed commercially and critically, and the following year brought G.I. Jane, in which she famously shaved her head to play a Navy SEAL trainee. Both films earned her Razzie Awards for Worst Actress, a sharp contrast to the acclaim she had received earlier in the decade. After G.I. Jane, Moore largely stepped back from the spotlight, relocating to Haley, Idaho, to focus on raising her 3 daughters. She remained mostly out of major film work for several years before slowly returning to the screen in the 2000s, including a supporting role in Charlie's Angels, Full Throttle in 2003. Before any of her more famous relationships, Moore was briefly married to musician Freddie Moore from 1981 to 1985, a marriage from which she kept her professional surname. In 1987, she married actor Bruce Willis, at the time one of the biggest stars in Hollywood thanks to Die Hard and Moonlighting. The couple had 3 daughters together: Rumor, born in 1988, Scout, born in 1991, and Tallulah, born in 1994, and for much of the 1990s were regarded as one of Hollywood's most prominent families. Moore and Willis divorced in 2000, but the split was notably amicable by industry standards, and the two continued to co-parent their daughters closely in the years that followed, a dynamic that would later become relevant again in different ways as both of their lives changed. It was in the years after this divorce, while raising her daughters largely on her own and navigating a slower period in her career, that Moore met Ashton Kutcher. Moore and Kutcher met in 2003 at a dinner party, and the pairing was instant tabloid fuel. She was 41, a mother of 3, and a veteran of some of the biggest films of the previous decade, He was 25, a rising star from that '70s show whose career was just beginning to take off. The 15-year age gap between them became a headline before their relationship had even settled into itself. And Moore has said in interviews that being publicly cast as an older woman with a much younger boyfriend, sometimes reduced in the press to the word cougar, was something she absorbed more painfully than she let on at the time. They moved quickly. Kutcher was introduced to her daughters within months of the relationship beginning. By September 2005, the two were married in a private ceremony in Beverly Hills. Notably, Bruce Willis, Moore's ex-husband and the father of her 3 children, attended and publicly supported the marriage, a detail that became part of the story the media told about the unconventional, blended family the 3 of them were trying to build together. To outside observers, Moore and Kutcher looked like a Hollywood power couple who had figured out how to make an unusual arrangement work. What the public did not know yet was that, before they had even married, the couple had already been through one of the most painful experiences either of them would later describe publicly. In 2019, Demi Moore released her memoir, Inside Out, and gave interviews to outlets, including the New York Times ahead of its publication. In it, she revealed for the first time that she had been pregnant with Kutcher's child before their wedding, sometime after the two began dating in 2003. The couple had a name picked out, Chaplain Ray, for the daughter they were expecting. Moore has described that at close to 6 months into the pregnancy, at what should have been a routine ultrasound, doctors found no heartbeat. In the memoir, she wrote about the moment the room's silence replaced what had, until then, been a familiar sound on the monitor, and about how quickly hope turned into devastation. She described feeling decimated, and said she shifted almost immediately into what she called survival mode, a phrase she has repeated in subsequent interviews about that period of her life. She has spoken about blaming herself in the aftermath, replaying decisions from the pregnancy, including moments when she had a drink before realizing she was pregnant, even though there was no medical basis connecting those choices to the loss. The miscarriage came at a point when Moore had built nearly 2 decades of sobriety, and by her own account, the grief that followed was part of what pulled her back toward drinking. Kutcher, for his part, has since acknowledged in interviews, including a 2023 cover story with Esquire, that he tried to support her through the loss, but that as a man in his 20s at the time, he was grieving from a very different place in his life than Moore was in hers. He told the magazine that losing a child you believe you are about to have is deeply painful, and that everyone processes that kind of loss differently. The couple went on to pursue fertility treatments, including IVF, hoping to have a biological child together. According to Moore's account, none of the attempts succeeded. What had once felt like a shared goal that might anchor the marriage instead became another site of quiet strain between them. Moore has written candidly about the way she tried to adapt herself to the relationship in the years that followed the miscarriage, describing, in her memoir, an urge to be seen as fun, spontaneous, and carefree in a way that sometimes meant setting aside the caution and structure she had spent years building into her adult life, including her sobriety. She has spoken about the emotional cost of being publicly framed as the older woman in the relationship, and about laughing along with jokes about their age gap in public even as, privately, it wore at her sense of self-worth. In Inside Out, Moore also addressed a period in which she and Kutcher opened parts of their relationship to include other partners, something she has written she agreed to, in part, out of a desire to keep Kutcher close and to feel desired by him. She has described these experiences as leaving her with lasting feelings of shame afterward, and has said she came to see them as one of several ways she compromised her own boundaries and sense of self during the marriage. This is one of the more widely reported and discussed revelations from her memoir, and it drew significant media attention and public conversation when the book was released in 2019, in part because Moore chose to describe it in her own words rather than let it remain the subject of rumor. By 2011, public reporting, later addressed separately by both Moore and Kutcher, pointed to infidelity as a central factor in the marriage's breakdown, including reports at the time that Kutcher had been involved with other women. Moore has said she learned of the situation not directly from Kutcher, but through outside sources, and that when she confronted him, he did not deny it. The couple separated in November 2011, and Moore announced the split publicly that month. Their divorce was not finalized until 2013, 2 years later. Kutcher has since spoken about the end of the marriage as well, including in his 2023 interview with Esquire, describing the divorce and the miscarriage as some of the hardest periods of his life and acknowledging feeling, in his own words, like a failure in the relationship. He also spoke about the renewed media attention his family faced when Moore's memoir was published years later, noting that the timing brought reporters back to his children's school after a period of relative privacy. Kutcher has since remarried to actress Mila Kunis, with whom he shares 2 children. The years immediately after the separation were, by Moore's own account, the darkest of her adult life. In January 2012, she was hospitalized after a widely reported incident at her home involving nitrous oxide and synthetic cannabis, which triggered a seizure. Paramedics who responded at the time described her as semi-conscious. The episode became public and marked a turning point in how directly the press was covering her personal struggles. In the years that followed, Moore has spoken about a relapse into drinking, disordered eating, and a broader period she has described as losing touch with who she was. Her relationship with her 3 daughters, Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, became strained during this stretch. In interviews tied to the memoir's release, Moore described real distance from her daughters as she worked through her own crisis, though she has generally focused more, in public remarks, on the reconciliation that eventually followed than on cataloging the specifics of the years apart. What she has been consistent about is that this period forced a genuine reckoning. She has described entering treatment, doing the work of getting sober again, and confronting not just the end of her marriage but unresolved grief from the miscarriage years earlier, describing the process as one of having to rebuild her sense of identity almost from the ground up. She has also connected this period to the broader themes she later revisited in Inside Out. The difficulty of separating who she actually was from the roles. Wife, mother, movie star, she had spent decades performing for other people. The reconciliation with her daughters is a part of the story Moore has spoken about with more warmth than almost anything else in her memoir and subsequent interviews. She has credited her daughters, Tallulah in particular, with helping to reopen the relationship after a period of real distance, describing family therapy in a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding trust between them. In public appearances and interviews since, all 3 daughters have spoken supportively about their mother, and Moore has often appeared alongside them at public events, including during her recent run of award season appearances for The Substance. Throughout this period, and in the years since, Bruce Willis remained a constant presence in Moore's life, not as a romantic partner, but as a co-parent and, by multiple accounts, a genuine friend. When Willis was diagnosed with aphasia in 2022 and later with frontotemporal dementia, Moore was among the family members who spoke publicly about supporting him and his wife, Emma Hemming Willis, through his declining health. It has often been described as a continuation of the unconventional but enduring family structure the 2 of them built after their own divorce more than 2 decades earlier. The same family structure that, in a different form, once included Ashton Kutcher as well. When Inside Out was published in September 2019, it was notable less for any single revelation and more for how directly Moore chose to describe her own life. Her chaotic childhood, an account of being raped at 15, her marriages to both Willis and Kutcher, her struggles with addiction, and the seizure that became a public low point in 2012. Moore has said in interviews that the book began years earlier as a project focused more narrowly on the mothers and daughters in her family, and that its scope shifted after the 2012 health scare forced her to reckon more directly with the full arc of her own story. The book became a bestseller, and reviewers and readers alike noted that its power came less from scandal than from the specificity and honesty of Moore's account of a marriage and a life that had, from the outside, looked far more polished than it actually felt from the inside. Ahead of its release, Moore also posed nude for the cover of Harper's Bazaar at the age of 56, an image widely covered at the time as another example of the same reclaiming of narrative that ran through the book itself. The release of Inside Out did more than generate headlines about Moore's own life. It fed into a broader, ongoing conversation about how the entertainment industry and the press had treated women of her generation, particularly around age, body image, and the public scrutiny that came with being one of the most photographed women in the world for 4 decades. Coverage of the book frequently connected her account of the marriage to Kutcher and the cougar framing that surrounded it to a wider pattern of how older women in relationships with younger men were discussed differently and often more harshly than the reverse. Moore herself has said in interviews that part of her reason for writing so candidly was to be the one defining that story, rather than continuing to let tabloids define it for her. The book was also notable for how it reframed several moments the public had already lived through in real time. The seizure in 2012, the divorce filings, the paparazzi photographs of a visibly thinner Moore in the early 2010s, by finally supplying the context that had been missing when those stories first broke. Readers and critics noted that much of what had once been treated as tabloid spectacle read, in Moore's own telling, as the visible symptoms of a much longer private struggle. That reframing is part of why the memoir was received not simply as a celebrity tell-all, but as a document that changed how a significant chapter of recent pop culture history was understood. Before The Substance became the project that redefined her career in the eyes of critics and awards bodies, Moore had already spent years working steadily in smaller and more varied roles, many of which drew far less attention than her 1990s output, but which she has described as part of a deliberate effort to find work that interested her rather than work that simply kept her visible. She appeared in television projects and streaming series through the 2010s and early 2020s, including a role in the FX anthology series Feud, Capote vs. The Swans in 2024, the same year The Substance premiered. Moore has spoken about turning down other opportunities during this stretch, and about a period before The Substance script arrived when she considered stepping back from acting almost entirely. In her Golden Globes acceptance speech in January 2025, she referenced this directly, describing how a producer had once dismissively labeled her a popcorn actress, a term she said she internalized for years as meaning she wasn't allowed to be taken seriously, even as her films made money. Winning the award, she said, felt like a correction to a belief she had carried and accepted for far too long. Alongside her professional resurgence, Moore's family life in the 2020s has been shaped significantly by Bruce Willis's health. After his diagnosis with aphasia in 2022 and the subsequent diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia disclosed by his